Okay, so I'm back. It got too dark, so I needed to come upstairs. So this is part 2 of Divinity and Diversity. That's actually a picture of Marjorie and myself at a visit that we had. Actually, it wasn't a visit, it was a trip. And that is Hegel's grave. We are in Germany there. Some of you will know who Hegel is. He was a philosopher in the 19th century, a big important one. Anyway, so there we are. So getting back to the book. So we were talking about creation. And creation, so how does she understand what creation is? She thinks about, we have to think about creation in the context in which we can dialogue with followers of other religion. And doing that opens us to a greater understanding of other religions, of other people, of ourselves, and of God. And this is an important element. This is the takeaway here. Whether you get to the philosophical details of it, the takeaway is that the dialogue can help us learn more about ourselves and about other people and about God. In the beginning was the relation. That's a process theology's view of creation. That nothing exists without that relationality. And that relationships themselves are essential and primary to God. They are not only essential and primary to God, they are essential and primary to humans. What does it mean to be a human, but to be in relation with others? They are integral to our identity. She talks about Genesis. And when we begin talking about creation, she talks about Genesis, and she names that the way that Genesis is often translated makes it seem as though God created out of nothing. But in fact, as you read the Bible, and those of you who have taken Hebrew Bible perhaps have gotten a little more context in which Genesis is written, it doesn't say out of nothing. In the beginning, the world was without form. It was without form. It was just unformless stuff. Creation then is a creation out of formless stuff, out of chaos. There is mere chaos. And God's creation brings order, in which possibilities are made actual. And we often think about possibilities as the good and actual as the bad, but in fact, too much possibility leads to nothing. Well, it doesn't lead to nothing. It leads to chaos, right? It leads to something that can't be, nothing can be done. It's actuality that we need. We need something actual. Now, it's good that we also have possibilities in the midst of the actual and in the context of the actual. And that is what creation is about. Creation is also about creating a new order out and a new actuality out of the possibilities that the past has given us. Out of what we have there to work with, and then God's ideas of possibilities. God is the creator in and of a creation of relational context in which diversity is married to well-being. So here's the core of what Marjorie is talking about here, is that diversity is very important for her. Understanding the differences and the fact that the world is made up of a complex of differences. We're not all the same, and yet we are all in it together. This reminds me of the U2 song, "We Are One, but We're Not the Same." And what is important about that diversity, about that multiplicity, is that it is also all about well-being. We are all working together to create well-being for all. The particularity of each entity is known and valued by God. And it is engaged with, lured, or God tries to influence with novelty rather than control. God influences with things that are positive and appealing to us, and are perhaps new. And God wills us, or will's the wrong word. God tries to get us to come in this direction toward well-being, the values toward which God aspires and God encourages us to inspire are well-being. Now, she understands the way that God operates in terms of creation as similar to a religious or a worship style called call and response. And this call and response is where one is the pastor or God calls, and the congregation or me or you or the people respond. There's the relational give and take, a dancing back and forth. God's call is distinct and personal to me, and therefore is unique in comparison to what God calls to others. And thus the response that others might give is unique, or that I might give is unique in relation to others. How do I respond to God's call? What I do in response to God's call may look different than what you do in response to God's call. My response is distinctive and dependent upon my context, my personal past, my personal present, and what possibilities are available. God's call is distinct and personal to you, and therefore may be unique and when you're trying to compare it to the response of others. And your response is distinct and dependent upon your context and your personal past and present and options for the future. Well, I think that's an important way of thinking about creation. And she sees that as how we can understand the difference between religions, is that different religions have different calls and thus have different responses, and thus sense the sacred in different ways. Now, Christians typically respond to God in similar ways, although not all the same, whereas Muslims may respond in a different way, and Buddhists respond in a completely different way. But all of us may be responding faithfully to God's call, even though our responses may be different. This is the key that she's offering. Now, if we go on to the next, so that has some implications then for how we think about religious dialogue as well. And there's more information there in the chapter, so I encourage you to read that. Now, she also goes on to talk, I'm simply giving you something that I hope will help you in your reading. The next chapter she talks about is incarnation, and she calls this radical incarnation because God is radically in the world. God is radically present in each and every moment, in each and every becoming, which is unique. Every moment is a unique moment of becoming something new. What you have become while you've been listening to this is new. You've learned new things. You have new thoughts, new ways of perhaps understanding those yourself and those who are different from you, and theology itself. Therefore, claiming parallel truths according to context and situation is not incoherent. Does that make sense? There may be truths that are parallel, not the same, but they're parallel because our contexts are different. So it's not it's not an incoherent claim. It's not incoherent to say that that can be the case. Truths are different vis-a-vis their relationship to the need and the perspective of those in the context and the situation. So now Suchocki talks about incarnation as God's immanence. And God's immanence is known and experienced more deeply than rational thinking and objective claims can articulate. This is experience, but even more deeply than even your conscious constructive sentences can articulate. God's immanence is radically incarnate within each of us on all occasions for each and every moment. And this looks and feels different according to our culture, our experience, and our religious symbol system. The Lord is my light and my salvation. This is a great example of how this is something that Christians would say. And we might say that because it's in the biblical texts. We might say that Jews might say that as well, since it is a psalm. But the question then is God, if God is the light of my salvation, is this light a particle or a wave? Now, I encourage you to read this little article here. You can't see me now. I've lost you. Hang on. I encourage you to read that little article on the difference between a particle and a wave. Here we have the fact that light is both a particle and a wave, depending on when we're looking at it and the method by which we are looking at it. How are we looking at it? How are we trying to see it, so to speak, or trying to measure it? This is a short video that you can look at.
There's a saying that like, if something's weird, it's an opportunity to expand your understanding. And I'm talking about the subatomic world today, which is weird, all right? It's just deeply, fundamentally strange. It's so weird, it's almost impossible to describe, even though I'm going to devote a couple of videos to it. But using language, like words in English, and, whatever language of your choice, describing how the subatomic world works, describing how the quantum world works, is virtually impossible, and it's more confusing than enlightening almost every single time. But this is exactly why we have mathematics. Mathematics allows us to grapple with concepts and make predictions and understand nature where human language fails. So the mathematics of quantum mechanics.
So I'm going to encourage you to read that, listen to that on your own. And that's not it. Where did you go? There you are. Okay. Can I get you back here? There we are. Okay. So notice that even a physicist has a difficult time talking about whether or not light is a particle or a wave. And there's no way to really talk about that. He's got to refer to mathematics to try to talk about it. That it is both a particle and a wave, but neither a particle or a wave, but both and not. And in some way, God is the light of my salvation. God is not, you can't pinpoint God, right? But to say that God is my light and my salvation is in some way to say that our religious language, our rituals, our symbols, are abstractions from our actual experience and cannot really communicate fully what it is we're experiencing and who God is. And even my experience of God is certainly not God is not limited to my experience of God, nor to your experience of God, or any human or any of creation's experience. So God cannot be reduced to our language, to our rituals, our symbols, but God is beyond them and God is beyond us. The question of, is God a trinity or a singularity or a multitude or simply beyond numbers, is part of the question here that Suchocki is raising. And I encourage you to reflect upon that when you're thinking about God. Now, this creative lure that Suchocki's talking about, and I know that some of you don't like the word lure, but this notion in which God is inviting us, is hoping that we come in a certain direction, and is doing what God can to try to get us to come in that direction without controlling us. But it is about luring us or trying to get us to move toward a better future. God incarnates with us, and in every moment, helping us bring the past into a synthesized harmony in this present moment. And God is also trying to pull us forward and project us drawing us toward a creative and constructive option for the future. This is called the superject. If you hear her talking about a superject and something, that's what she's talking about. Something that even in the moment of the present, there is a thought of where we're going next. And that is the superject, that the future, that the past is not, that the present is not stop in the present, but rather has an anticipation of the next moment. Now, Suchocki talks about this radical carnation of God that is within each of us, and that God is radically incarnate in each of us in unique and different ways. Is it possible, I wonder, for you to cherish and follow the truth of your own religion, while at the same time honoring the truths of another religion? And that's the question that Suchocki is asking us to entertain, to hope that we can open ourselves up to that. She's suggesting here in this radical incarnation that there could be multiple ways of understanding who God is, multiple truths perhaps, multiple ways of engaging with God. God grounds the possibilities of the world and the call of God to each moment. And that is a call to what, given its past, it may yet become. But that call comes as an influence, even as the past is also an influence. God's call is an influence toward whatever form of becoming can work for that particular entity, in that particular place, in that as that piece of reality emerges into the next moment. I encourage you to reflect upon this. There is always in process theology a kind of progression toward harmony and complexity, in which contrasts are turned, or conflict is turned into contrasts that add to the beauty of the whole. Now, the next chapter is called the Image of God. And the image of God, as I've already mentioned to you, is something that many philosophers or theologians have talked about as that thing that all humans have in common. We are all made in the image of God, which is in the biblical text in creation, when Genesis, when God says, "Let us make humanity in our image. And in the image of God, let us create them." Now, some folks theologically, some theologians in our Christian history have named this image of God, this imago Dei, as being something like memory, intellect, and will, that we all have memory, intellect, and will. And you notice it's Trinitarian. Some have also named it as such a, so that's Irenaeus talks about memory, intellect, and will. Contemplative knowing and practical knowing and will is Augustine and St. Thomas as well. Although Augustine and St. Thomas have different ways of thinking about how that engages. But so for Augustine, there's a contemplative knowledge. So the image of God that's present in us is Trinitarian. There's an aspect of the presence of God, or our awareness of God in us, as being contemplative, knowing who God is. And then there's one that is a practical knowing, and a faculty of practical knowing how to do things in the world, and then a faculty of will. Or, Suchocki suggests, is this image of God summative? Is it something that could be manifest actually in human community as we come together, with each religion offering a piece of this marvelous puzzle that is God, that is the image of God? Now, just a little bit of history of this concept. All three of these great theologians of the past differentiate the terms image of God from the notion of likeness of God, because both of those are mentioned in the biblical text, Genesis, to denote, and they decide that those mean differences in between what Adam's sin effected in human being. Human sin, Adam's sin, changed the way in which humans are, as opposed to the way that humans were created. Then this image of God, it gets damaged in this fall, but the likeness of God is lost completely. The image of God is not fully the image of God is fully restored in the Trinitarian structure of the human soul with Jesus, although the image of God does not include the body, according to Augustine and Aquinas. Whereas the likeness of God, which is the capacity to behold and become like God in goodness and justness, which is sanctification, is not returned until the end of one's life, or the end of time in the kingdom or in the reign of God. The full perfection of the image and likeness of God is the heavenly state of glory, in which we will be returned to the original state of creation, in which we will have the full image and full likeness of God as reflecting that in our being. And that's the history of the concept of this image of God. Martin Luther continued. Martin Luther talks about the image of God, or the imago Dei, as something that got deeply corrupted and distorted by sin, original sin, and then continues to be corrupted by our sinning. The eternal aspects of humanity remain in this image of God, and they are fixed by Christ. Christ heals that. When we are able to participate by faith in Christ, but this doesn't become visible or fully present in the way that we live in the world until the second coming, until Christ will return. Now, that's Martin Luther. John Wesley, so those of you who are Lutheran or Reformed or Protestant in some way, maybe follow that. And maybe it's not something that you're thinking this is explicit in your theology or explicit in your religious experiences in your church, but it may be something that you see in the hymns, and it may be something that's implicit in your embedded theology. Now, John Wesley and the Wesley traditions see the image of God as, this is what he names, the heart filled to overflowing with love toward God and one another. That's how Wesley named it. And he talks about how this image of God is never really lost, but that we are growing more and more toward bringing it to be fully uncorrupted, to be like the likeness of God, changed from glory into glory. And you've probably heard that if you've listened to some Methodist hymns. And that is seen as the fullness of God's love and presence within us that is coming into fruition in the process of sanctification, or as a good Wesleyan would say, in the process of becoming more loving toward others, this process of perfection. Now, moving to Suchocki, the image of God in the context in which pluralism is affirmed, Suchocki develops the views that we've just talked about of the Imago Dei, but she insists that the image is communal and not merely individual. And thus, she believes that it is established in and through irreducible diversity. It is established through community, through relating with each other and with those who are different from us in community that respects and observes and respects and enjoys, appreciates this irreducible diversity, that sees something beautiful in a different way of seeing things. And this is known as the community of communities. God is internally interrelated to God's self, as the notion of Trinity names. And so also we are internally related with ourselves and with each other across and throughout the globe. So I encourage you to reflect upon that this is the notion of the image of God and kind of what does it mean to be human? It means that we bring the image of God into ourselves and are internally related with God as we relate with ourselves and relate with others and themselves as divinely created and respected creatures throughout the globe. There is an understanding in the Christian view of the Trinity called paracleresis. And paracleresis, and this is an image of it here, where you see these little stick figures, some of them doing yoga. They're called to embrace the differences between each other, just as we are called to embrace those who are different from ourselves and incarnate the unity of God's perichoretic love. And the perichoretic love is this internal dancing of the Trinity within and among each other. This is a symbol or metaphor for the relationship of religions with each other. So this could be perhaps the Buddhism kind of yogic view. Perhaps this is more of a Christian view, and perhaps this is more of a Muslim view, or I'm not sure, Jainism, whatever, various different religions, and that and as they interrelate with each other, they have a uniqueness, but they are internally related with each other, and that is what she sees as the call of religion. Now, those are the first part. That's the first part of the book, Divinity and Diversity, and we will be talking about some of the questions in the second part of the book in your small groups, and you'll be looking at those in more detail for next time. But for our coming together for this class, I encourage you to reflect upon these discussion questions. You can read these, and maybe you have some other discussion questions that you'd like to share or talk about. But, what are your responses to this notion as a communal term rather than individual? Does it help you think about creative religious pluralism or religious pluralism in creative ways? What is your notion or your response to Suchocki's notion of creation as contextual rather than absolute and universal, so that creation is happening all the time? And what is your view of if you're a counseling folk, how does this view of Imago Dei as communal help or hinder your treatment of a client or a concerned parishioner? You might have a case study that you might bring to mind. And these might be things that we could talk in small groups with. And we'll see you in class.